Yoshiyota. I'm a director of Nippon Foundation Ocean Nexus Research Center in Earth Lab of University of Washington College of Environment. I'm delighted for this opportunity. I cannot thank enough to APRU to provide us this wonderful chance for us to share this new initiative, Ocean Nexus, and really to embark us upon this new conversation about oceans and social equity. And then I like to emphasize, I want to use the term oceans instead of ocean, because we really like to embrace our diversity. And this is one of the beautiful things. If you're thinking about Pacific Rim, so many different universities, different cultures, different students, and we are uphold on mobilization right now, but our mind still can travel, and we can share these new thoughts about it. So this is a wonderful opportunity for us, and what I really like is for you all participants to join us in this conversation and perhaps learn about what do we mean by what you mean, what I mean by the oceans, but social equity in the oceans. This is very difficult in large-scale conversations, but it comes down to our fundamental appreciation about human beings, human well-beings, and nature that we are surrounded by, which are cannot be really separated, in my opinion. So this is a core understanding of social equity and the oceans, the nature, culture together, and then let's think it integratively. And then also, I like to emphasize the Ocean Nexus is really taking this as a moral approach. The coastal communities is really facing a lot of difficulties now. The potential unstrategized development, which may actually bring harm to particular sectors. The climate change and all more of the response to the climate change is also threatening or even benefiting just a small portion of the people. There are many difficult societal issues of the oceans that we need to deal with. What about supply chain management? What about food sovereignty? What about rights of the people who've been living both in indigenous setting and potentially not? So those are conversations we really like to open and then hold it. And today I'm delighted to have my 5 colleagues, and I'm going to ask them, on your behalf, what is the research contribute to social equity in an ocean? What is particular approach that you're taking, and what's the relevance to the international conversation now we have for blue economy, sustainable development goals, and for Pacific? What do we mean by the social equity? So I'm really hoping that you join us in the conversation. And if you feel like you wanted to question us, please put it in the chat, and I'm trying to catch up as much as I can. If not, we can actually retrace it afterwards and ask APRU to potentially help some ways to answer those questions. So please encourage yourself to join the conversation. So first of all, I'm just gonna be very quick about what Ocean Nexus is. Nippon Foundation Ocean Nexus is a research center which consists of partnerships of different researchers from different universities. Within UW, we have different departments working together: Public Health Information School, College of Environment, Public Policy School, and I think that would be it. Right, and also outside of University of Washington, we have 20 different institutes. And this is really the partnership of individual researchers coming together to really use the network to mobilize our way of advancing social equity in an ocean, both as a research and potentially contribute to any action which would actually bring some change. So that's the Ocean Nexus. We'll have a website. If you Google Ocean Nexus UW, you can find it. So I shouldn't really explain no more. And I already explained who I am. I'm a director, Yoshiyota. I'm an anthropologist by training, but I also work on the governance and the public policy. Now, because this is APRU, I wanted to introduce my dear colleague, Director Ben Packard. He's the director of Earth Lab. And Ocean Nexus has become so possible And because of the Earth Lab, this is a new function and role and model of the university. And I'll pass it to Ben so that Ben can actually explain what Earth Lab is. Ben.
Thank you, Yoshi, and thank you, APRU, and all of you for joining us here today. As Yoshi said, I have the privilege of serving as the executive director at Earth Lab, and we are thrilled to have Ocean Nexus program in Earth Lab at the University of Washington. It's an innovative approach that clearly captures all of the central elements of Earth Lab's mission: interdisciplinary activity through the lens of equity and justice, and with a focus on applied research. The University of Washington Regents in 2008 established the College of the Environment. They not only created the largest college in the United States, the College of Environment in the United States, and that creating the largest wasn't going to fulfill their mission. They wanted to simultaneously build the capacity to actually support transdisciplinary work addressing our most complex environmental challenges. This is now what we call Earth Lab. And I invite you to think about Earth Lab as a bridge connecting research to action and decision makers, and a bridge that supports our faculty and community organizations that endeavor to work together to solve some of the most complex environmental challenges we face. For decades, researchers at the University of Washington, and frankly, all of your wonderful universities, have been on the leading edge of trying to understand strategies for human resilience. But we have historically only rewarded that activity nestled deeply in our respective silos. I probably don't need to explain that to all of you. So Earth Lab and our member organizations catalyze research and collaboration on real applied problems and questions, from marine plastics to sea level rise, to equity in the oceans, to the health benefits of nature in treating PTSD. There's real demand for our research to be applied to real problems. But here's the deal. Solving complex environmental challenges takes engagements from all sectors and disciplines to ensure a better future. And we see other sectors are stepping up. Non-governmental organizations, governments, the corporate sector are all seeking to address environmental challenges in this multidisciplinary, multi-sector way. So absent the depth and breadth of research across disciplines, perspectives, knowledge systems, and lived experience, our efforts to apply research on developing solutions run the risk of being incomplete or potentially misdirected. So Earth Lab has 6 member organizations alongside the Ocean Nexus Center, where the magic of science to action, as we call it, happens. We've got the Climate Impacts Group, which is celebrating its 25th anniversary, that's been modeling climate impacts in the Pacific Northwest and beyond. We've got the Ocean Acidification Center, which has worked closely with tribes, with other coastal communities on monitoring in real time ocean acidification data. We've got the Nature and Health Initiative that I mentioned that's looking at different populations and the human health benefits and as it relates to exposure to nature. We've got the Doris Duke Conservation Scholars Programs, where we're one of 4 nodes across the United States looking at building the capacity and the diversity of future conservation scholars across the country. And lastly, we've got the Future Rivers Program, which is training graduate students to work across sectors and across disciplines, and funded by the National Science Foundation. So in addition to all these centers, we have the capacity to also catalyze new transdisciplinary collaborations that we call our innovation grants. And in this annual process, we seek to invest in new collaborations that involve students, faculty, and collaborators in the very early stage development of their applied research. Our core team operations are advised by an advisory council with representation from a broad variety of experiences and chaired by former Secretary of the Interior, Sally Jewell, and a faculty steering committee, which represents a broad swath of the University of Washington faculty. The governance at Earth Lab comes from an advisory board of 11 deans from across the university. And I share this with all of you because you can appreciate the complexity of an organization with this kind of advisory functions and governing bodies across the university. But the structure is really meant to leverage the core operations of a small group with a suite of support services to support our faculty, researchers, and students' efforts to apply research. And this comes in the forms of all the basic grant and contracts administration, finance operations, communications, and other critical issues that all of our centers rely on to do their work so well. Our member organizations and our grantees are addressing critical questions and work directly with community stakeholders from a variety of sectors, as well as with Indigenous community partners. So in closing, I just want to say thank you again for this opportunity to share a little bit about Earth Lab at the University of Washington. We are the hub at the University of Washington for addressing complex environmental challenges where applied science will be easily accessible to decision makers and where research is driven to be both usable and actually used. So we're honored to be represented today through the Ocean Nexus Center, and for Yoshi and all of the colleagues that you're going to hear from today to consider EarthLab their home base here at the University of Washington. Thanks all for your time today and for your efforts on behalf of our oceans. I look forward to learning from you and alongside you.
Thank you very much, Ben. And I just want to follow up, and I wanted to say, so the Ocean Nexus is really the collaboration between University of Washington and Nippon Foundation. Nippon Foundation gives us the commitment and the funding, but the funding is not just shared only by University of Washington, but it goes to our partnership universities. Operation is, you know, I gotta say, everybody works in the universities, right? So it's very tedious, and you know, we have to be very due diligent, you know, keep the transparency, and then all this, you know, the Ben, what do you think is a challenge so far, you know, dealing with me and Ocean Nexus and a bunch of those, and what has been rewarding you?
What has been rewarding me?
Yeah.
Well, rewarding me, I'll start there because that's the more fun part, is seeing the diversity of issues that are being addressed through all the fellows, through all the PIs, through all the research. It's incredible, the number of topics. And just by way of background, I come to this work after working at the Nature Conservancy for 4 years, and prior to that, 15 years at Starbucks Coffee Company. So I've seen the corporate and some of the NGO perspectives in addressing complex challenges. And the variety of perspectives and lived experiences and knowledge systems that you're tapping through this network is undoubtedly going to provide useful information and benefit people who matter the most in our work. So that's the fun part. You all are doing really complex work. You're at lots of different universities. We are actually a state agency in the state of Washington here in the United States. So we have complexities and bureaucracies that are very strong. And sometimes that gets in the way of being nimble. But you know what? Our approach is to make it work. And Yoshi and team, we're here to support you and do what we can to get through the bureaucracy and get to the focus on the real work.
Thank you very much, Ben. I just wanted to emphasize research is really a collaborative work, not just a single researchers, and it's a teamwork. You know, we have ideas, we can execute it, but in execution, we have a lot of team collaborating. So I really wanted to thank EarthLab, and I wanted to thank the EarthLab staff, you know, who's just dealing with everyday complexity and really make it happen and protect the researchers and sharing resources together. So thank you very much, Ben. I wanted to emphasize that.
Yes, I'll pass that along to my colleagues because I just get to talk about it, but they're doing a lot of the work. So I will be sure to pass that along. Thank you.
Yeah, and then I just also wanted to thank our Dean Lisa Greenwich, University of Washington College of Environment. It was really Lisa's vision, and with her embracing this idea about let's put, you know, Nexus, you know, some very different issue together and develop it, and then develop it on EarthLab. With that vision and support, we can really do it. So, you know, Lisa, thank you so much. Okay, now I'm gonna bring it to my colleague in the Ocean Nexus, and we're going to talk about social equity and ocean. Thanks, Ben. Now, before we talking about it, I just wanted to do self-promotion. You know, some of you don't like it, but I'm going to do it. So this is a book published last year. It's called Predicting Future Ocean. It's quite thick, right? It has 50 chapters about future ocean. Everything from climate change to sustainable development to blue economy. So the base of the Ocean Nexus is really coming from this. This is another program that I run together with my colleague from UBC before I came to UW. And from this book, I have to basically conclude all the 50 chapters, and then came to the two conclusions. One, global environmental change and also societal economic change will actually make make it ocean and us difficult to achieve sustainability. So that's the one thing, and it's very hard to deny. Everybody, you know, kind of like knows that, and you're also like nodding, yeah, I know about this. The second part is really the equity. So the distribution of benefit from the ocean became much more unequal and much harder to achieve equitable the distribution and the procedure and the systems in the future because of those changes, and the inequality became widened in the future. That's sort of like a second thing. So this idea about, you know, equity and becomes so important. It's really coming from all these different researches, from climate change to everything else. It just shows everything just gets widened. There's people who get benefit, people who doesn't. And it really was very clear, and any of the research actually really shows that. So we thought, okay, we need to connect this more or less scientific and research result into policy and real action. We need to make the research to close these gaps, so we can really have much more equal and justice world. So that was really our start. But to start, we have to find out, what the social equity is, and so that was really our first step. So I'm going to bring my colleague, Kate Crossman. Dr. Crossman, his background is governance, and she has a PhD from the Evans Policy School at UW. And Kate is, I just wanted to start a conversation asking you, in ocean governance, as I said, the gap between policy and science is really often discussed by the researchers, but we just wanted to know, how do you see your work, particularly addressing social equity, would fill this gap? Can you just explain to us a little bit about it? Okay.
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you so much, Yoshi, and thank you all, everybody in the audience, for being here. It's so nice to get a chance to share our learning and our ideas with you. And of course, thanks to Ben and all the folks over at Earth Lab. So the question is, what about this gap that we hear so much about between science and policy, and how does that relate to social equity, and what are we doing at Nexus to engage in that space? And I think that those comments that we hear so often really come from a place of frustration that centers on this idea that good policy would be the policy that just scientifically addresses scientifically defined problems, right? And that is a misunderstanding of public policy. As somebody whose disciplinary background in public policy, I can very confidently say that looks great on paper, but in fact is a misunderstanding of public policy and governance, because what public policy and governance actually has to do is deal with multiple competing objectives, of which technical effectiveness is really just one. So if we allow scientists to, in their perfect world, and imagine that scientists are a monolithic group, right? We can already just realize how ridiculous that is, right? But let's pretend that scientists are a monolithic group, and we allow scientists to define what the problems are and how to solve them, then we've already created an equity problem. Because scientists are not the only members of society who have opinions or interests that need to be represented and accounted for in policy and governance processes. And what we end up with is both problems and solutions that just have not been evaluated across other things that we as a society care about. So you hear a lot in public policy from people who have a strong interest in economics. We hear a lot about whether things are efficient, right, in an economic sense. We certainly hear a lot about effectiveness. And increasingly, particularly in the realm of ocean governance, we hear more and more about equity. These are all competing priorities, and we have to pick solutions. We have to both identify problems and choose solutions that are going to address all of our goals, not just one single one of our goals, right? And so if we, yeah, please go ahead.
No. Okay, I just wanted to kind of like the sort of like summarize what you just said. So you say there's a scientist, and then let's say every scientist agrees, like a climate change, right? This is what's happening, and then they might they probably agree, this is a solution, but what you're saying is, okay, we need more than that for the public policy, or but does that actually mean, can we start from scientific knowledge? Can we start from science, or where should we start?
Right. So I mean, so it depends on what you mean by start. This is every time you talk to a social scientist, right? Well, it depends. But it does, in this case, it really does depend on what you mean by start. So for instance, I'll go back to the idea of defining what the problem is, right? With climate change, we can think of an almost infinite number of different sort of constructions of what the problem is, right? The baseline problem is increased accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The applied problems that are impacting people's lives might be things like melting permafrost or rising sea levels or increased occurrence of large storms, or we can go on, fires, on and on and on and on, right? So if we want to solve the policy problem, we need to decide, wait, which problem are we going to solve? And in order to do that, it is not sufficient for scientists to say, this is the problem that matters. Because what that is this is the framing, this is the construction, this is the aspect of the problem that matters. And different people are going to have different things that they're going to identify as the central problem. So to your question, Yoshi, about what we're doing at Nexus to address this, that just leads perfectly into the first thing that I'm really excited about, which is that we're undertaking a program of policy analysis in conjunction with our researchers at all of these global institutions. So we have a policy analysis team. Policy analysis is an approach that's really widely used in applied policy decision-making, but it hasn't really yet gotten much wider traction. Policy analyses are designed to directly communicate with decision makers. They focus on really clearly scoped problems. So the climate change example is a good one. We could have taken any one of those problems, right? And they identify sets of potentially effective solutions. So effectiveness is one of the criteria, but then they evaluate those solutions across all of these different criteria of things that we care about in this situation as a society, not just as scientists, but as a society, right? So I'm really excited about this because I think that it will bring some transparency to this issue of the fact that we are always, when we're making policy decisions, we are always evaluating across dimensions, not just on one single dimension. And in our version of policy analysis, because we are very concerned with social equity, we're going to have multiple sort of equity criteria built in to really try to center that criteria in our analyses.
Okay, thank you very much, Kate. This is really exciting. It's kind of like a coupling with the research and the policy analysis, which is like a direct, line to communicate with the policymakers and then even the public, of course. And that really kind of like create a conversation with social equity, because it really, people hate to say that, but it really depends on the context. It depends on the values that we actually put in. But in kind of like a very shortest way to answer, if anybody asks about what the social equity is, what would you say? And I'm gonna let you wait until the end. Okay, would you mind just waiting until the conversation ends, and I'm gonna come back to you and then I'll ask you, okay, can you just say what the social equity is? What's the relevance to the ocean in the shortest sentence, so everybody hearing this conversation can actually take it back to home? Is that okay with you?
That's fine. You guys should leave me a lot of time. That's all I'm saying.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kate. So now I'm going to move to my colleague, Andres Cisneros, to this next question that I have. So as Kate said, okay, we really need to address policies. We really need to engage with the different sectors and in different interests and different benefits and different values, efficiency, all this. And in international platform, we got like two distinctive movement going on in the ocean. One is called the blue economy, and the other one, everybody knows, the rainbow circle, sustainable development goals. And then obviously there's a decade for ocean science. Some of the natural scientists might claim, what about decade? But obviously that's part of the sustainable development goals to some extent. So I want to ask, to Dr. Andres Cisneros Montemayor, is blue economy and SDG can be considered as a pathway for advancing equity in the ocean? Does he agree? What is the role of the researcher to influence those platforms? Andres Cisneros is research economist, PhD from University of British Columbia, and he's an economist, and now he's a deputy director of Ocean Nexus. Andreas, would you be able to answer this question?
Would I be able? I can answer something. I don't know if we're going to solve sort of the social equity question they asked Kate. Tweet length, Kate. Tweet length. That's a really interesting question, and I think I guess the first part of that is that I don't know that I do see SDGs or blue economy as pathways in and of themselves. They're more the goals that we've agreed upon that we'd all like to reach, right? And I think at the broadest level, the SDG, I'm sure, everyone listening has heard this before, no one should be left behind in our quest for sustainable development, is that sort of kind of underlying guiding principle, right? And so I think we can certainly use the SDGs because they're quite holistic to draw linkages between different types of goals that are sometimes really, really difficult to reconcile. Kate touched on this a little bit before. When we talk about, meeting poverty goals and economic growth goals and, ecological sustainability goals and institutional goals, each one of those things is a huge challenge in and of itself. And I think something that we have to recognize as we go forward is that while we can always find synergies, we're also going to have to be really honest about where the trade-offs are and where our priorities need to lie. And so that's kind of the first part. I think blue economy, my background, as you mentioned, is in resource economics. I'm from a fishing community. I've thought about oceans as resources and for, resource development for, everything I can remember. And so blue economy sort of has made it a little bit more tangible for me and I think for a lot of people. And sort of a way to say, all right, kind of bring everything down. What are we really talking about? And I think that's really interesting because people talk about a lot of different things when they talk about blue economy. You can talk about things that sound just like business as usual, just have your economic growth and maybe a few new sectors with emerging technologies. To me, and I think to a lot of people that are working in this space, we need to go back to the original meaning of blue economy when it was originally proposed, right? So this is sustainable development based on ocean resources. That is not just economically viable, that's kind of the financial corporate way of looking at it, but socially equitable and environmentally sustainable. And you can't lose sight of the equity component of blue economy. Otherwise, it's not really a new term. And so I think in that sense, a lot of the work that we're doing with Ocean Nexus is really focused on arguing for the fact that it's not really about where the resources are. That's what I've been doing for a lot of my career. And, we do these monitoring systems and remote sensing, underwater, all these sorts of things to find out where the fish are, where the mineral nodules are, where the mangroves are, value those ecosystem services. That's all important. But really the key, if we're going to achieve equity and sustainability, are the enabling conditions to establish those sectors that are equitable and sustainable, right? And those are things that may seem really intuitive, like controlling corruption or making sure there's enough infrastructure in place for access to credit, but there are also things that are much more deeper than that. Things such as, basic human rights, combating labor abuses, group and economic equity in different communities to avoid rent capture. And so I think that's where we can find the pathways. So again, to come back to the beginning, we know what the SDGs say, the countries agreed upon them. They're meant to be somewhat contextual, though some of them are quite specific in what we agree that we need to achieve. Blue economy is sort of a microcosm of that that's centered very much on the oceans. And it's in trying to meet those goals that we're going to find the pathways, by looking at what's happened before, by looking at the different dynamics that we see now, and different vulnerabilities that people are facing, that we're able to identify, what those strategies are, what those pathways are to reaching those goals.
Thank you very much. Andres, you originally from Mexico, and then you've been living in Canada for quite some time. You covers quite a bit of Pacific Rim in your career. Do you really see this sort of unable conditions and thinking about like a social equity would potentially kind of address the issues which quite few small fishing communities are facing in Canada, or even to the Mexico. How do you actually see we can approach? I mean, you're economist, but what you just said doesn't really reflect upon numbers. So how do you see what's your approach to that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think, as you said, I guess I cover most of NAFTA already, or what is it now? The USMCA, or TEMEC, as we call it in Mexico. Everyone has their own name for it. And I think so. The first part of that is that there's so many commonalities, and this applies so profoundly in communities across the board. And, where I'm from is very much a desert landscape. You're a beautiful, warm ocean, tropical fishery kind of thing. And here in Canada, when I first moved up here, my first jobs were working on fishing boats that in a very, very different and much, much colder environment. But a lot of the same worries, the same challenges that you see in people, again, aren't really to do with what types of fish we have, right? Those are interesting things of context or whatever, but the worries aren't there. The worries are, how am I going to make ends meet? How am I going to reach these markets? How am I going to make sure that what I'm selling is actually giving a benefit to my family in the long term, to my kids and that sort of thing. And so I think in that sense, really the problems, again, are very much in terms of the enabling conditions and not the resources themselves. That's not to say that we don't have environmental issues. Like, obviously we do want environmental sustainability. But again, that's not where the commonalities lie. And I think, I think for the Pacific Rim, the important thing to take away from this is that, we're very much connected environmentally. We do share a lot of these species that migrate across, and a lot of these, big, large marine ecosystems, right? So there are those commonalities. But I think, again, much more importantly, we share these different types of kinships to the oceans and relationships that, as you said, yes, they have financial components. Everyone worries about income, unless you have a lot of money, right? But that's not really where the issues lie, right? It goes way beyond the numbers.
Okay, thank you very much, Andres. It's very refreshing to hear things are way beyond the numbers from economists. So
that doesn't mean we don't look at them, but we have to recognize they're not the end all be all.
Absolutely. So, I mean, you're talking about like coastline of the Pacific Rim, and now as we talk about the Pacific, it's not just a coastline, it's not just rim. There is a huge water, in the middle.
Yeah.
So, I wanna take this conversation, but to another participant, another colleague of mine, Quentin Hannick, from University of Wollongong, UNCLOS. Quentin, you've been working in largest fisheries and for the Pacific and the tuna fisheries, and there is a undeniable historical inequity in fisheries governance in the Pacific. What are the problems? Really, is there still this inequity in the Pacific fisheries governance, and then how do we need to change the conversation between like states and the sectors and researchers about this? We're talking about like the big water right in the middle. Quentin, it's in the morning for you, I believe, in wherever you are. Would you be able to answer my question?
Thank you, Yoshi, and thank you everybody for attending. Apologies for the background noise. We're just returning from school holidays. But look, following up from Yoshi's points, and also the points that Kate and Andres have made as well, I particularly like where Kate was going with the science, because what we're talking about in the middle of the Pacific is the decision-making frameworks for how we actually make decisions about these management necessities. So Kate was talking about science, but the science will just advise you to actually make a decision on then how to respond. And there's multiple different options for then how to respond. And many of those options will impact in different ways on different communities. And our ocean governance framework goes some way to addressing the concerns of coastal states and small island developing states and small communities. But the problem that we have, of course, is that the decisions that actually then get made include everybody, including distant water fishing nations that come from completely different oceans. So at the moment, one of the big arguments we're having is how to respond to climate change impacts on tuna fisheries, how to respond to overfishing and overcapacity concerns on tuna fisheries. And these tuna fisheries are critical and fundamental to the food security and revenue for many of these small island developing states, whereas they're not particularly significant at a whole of government level to many of the distant water fishing nations. But nevertheless, we need to make a decision that can be implemented across all partners. And those decisions need to ensure that they don't apply a disproportionate burden of conservation limits on small island developing states, and that they ensure that there is a future for their participation and their development aspirations. And these are some of the critical questions that we are talking about in the Indo-Pacific region. Just in regard to then also building on some of the comments that were made before, the science that we have is only part of that. It's the actual engagement and participation of the communities at all levels then to actually engage in those processes. They have to be owned by everybody. And unfortunately, of course, that means that invariably some of the participants will likely be unhappy with some of the outcomes. But then we have to work out, well, what opportunities can we actually implement to make sure that we share the conservation limits in a way that reflects our principles. So, for example, in climate change, we have agreed this concept of differentiated responsibilities, that those states who have not caused the problem in the first place, and those states who are the most heavily impacted by climate change, should not then be further impacted by the types of conservation measures we need to put in place. So in fisheries, that means that we need to ensure that the limits enable development aspirations, enable food security, and enable any other things like that, without then further impacting heavily on those small developing states.
Okay, Quentin, can I ask you, this is something everybody's worried about. Are you driving?
No, I'm passengering. My family's
Thank God for that. You know, I should have asked you beforehand. And all the people who's listening to this, sorry about that. I should have asked Quentin beforehand. He's on a passenger seat. So it's all good. It's not illegal, anything whatsoever. But this is a new normal. Thank you very much for answering these questions. I mean, what you just basically said, yes, there has been issues with quota and then, you know, procedure for the deciding what the fishery management should be, you know, really how to share this huge tuna stock in the Western Pacific. And then there is kind of like an inequality between those Pacific Island states and those are not really coastal states. So somebody coming from far away and coming for the distant water fishing. And what you're saying is really the climate change is really changing this kind of like the distribution of the tuna as being the location. Used to be in the EEZ of Pacific Island states, and now potentially moving towards high seas. And then that actually means if people do not really know about this fishery governance, that means they don't have to go into somebody the EEZ and pay the money to fish it. They can just go to the high seas and fish it. So there's a little bit of climate justice issues. Basically, Pacific Islands never caused this problem. You know, they're not part of this, these issues from the beginning. And then now they almost being, you know, have to pay for it. And here's huge inequity. And that's what the Quentin is really talking about. Quentin, you know, well, if you can just, if you're not driving, I'm just going to ask one more question to it. The negotiation between the states and the negotiation between the sectors, it always comes down to this idea of who does the best modeling. You know, let's get the science, you know, very much precise. And so we actually do know how many fish are in the ocean. Is it still like that? You know, under the circumstances of the climate change, a lot of models really have to, you know, address this uncertainty. What's your take on this uncertainty and the fishery governance? Future of the fishery governance and the negotiation, do you think it's going to change?
Look, I personally don't think it's a lack of science that's the problem. I think with climate change impacts, yes, we could always need more science. We could always have a slightly more refined model. But we know enough to make decisions. The problem is actually making the decision. It's agreeing on the principles for how we actually implement the decision. That's the hard part. So in the Indian Ocean, for example, climate change isn't actually the biggest issue in the context of these big oceanic tuna fisheries. The biggest issue is actually dealing with the historical and colonial inequities and legacies of how the fisheries are actually managed. So in the Indian Ocean, we have large Spanish tuna fleets catching most of the fish in competition perhaps with other fisheries that are trying to develop in some of the small islands developing states, and also with a whole bunch of artisanal fishers that are also fishing for tuna right around the Indian Ocean region. But we need to make decisions because the historical overfishing of some of those tuna fishing stocks now requires a management decision. We need to limit yellowfin fisheries in the Indian Ocean, and that requires us to reduce catch. So at the moment, what we see, of course, is that the European Union, on behalf of the Spanish, will argue that the measures should be applied in an equitable fashion that should protect, historical, catches. Well, of course, if we do that, that will impact inequitably and heavily on the development aspirations of numerous developing coastal states. So we have enough science to recognise the problem, but we need to work out the decision-making frameworks. And the other important thing that we really need to focus on is the capacity development. We need to develop capacity development for science, policy, decision-making that actually reflects the local needs of the region rather than the priorities of the donor state. And we can do a lot more on capacity development as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Quentin. That answers perfectly. Can you just tell your son that his dad is working for intergenerational equity?
So my son is actually sitting in the back at the moment watching the VP debate
Yeah,
live streaming.
Okay.
Wow, it's pretty mature.
Okay, Quentin, thank you so much. And then participants, thank you very much for bearing this sound and everything. But, this is a reality and the new normal we're living in, but it makes our conversation much more inclusive. So, thanks a lot. It's all effort. So now we talk about the equity. We talk about like blue economy, sustainable development. We talked about the Pacific tuna fisheries, a variety of things, but I really want to come back to the nexus. And I want to invite my colleague, Professor Anna Spalding from Oregon State, and just ask her. Nexus is very much social science driven, and I know it's important, but I wanted to hear the Anna's opinion about like why this is important and an immediate approach for sustainability and perhaps even the human security among coastal populations. Anna. Again, you have a variety of experience engaging with very important platforms, and you've been working as a social scientist in this very much environmental issues. If you can just tell us, what do you think about my question, why Nexus or social science is really important, what we can do, and how can we collaborate definitely with natural scientists and to advance our mission to make social equity center for the ocean governance. Anna, I'll pass it to you.
Thank you, Yoshi. And thanks, APRU, also for the opportunity to talk about Nexus. As I always talk about it as sort of a place where ideas that have been growing. So from my background in social science, so from a very I guess telling the alternative story, telling other stories that we don't typically hear is sort of my background in social science. So when I met Yoshi and heard that this was something that they were trying to ground and sort of make the center of the center was really exciting. So I think as other folks have already said, ocean problems for a long time and still to this day really are under the purview of natural scientists, right? So ecologists, oceanographers, explorers even, right? So nothing to do with the social sciences for a variety of reasons. And that's not really, we don't need to talk about why, but for a variety of reasons, that's been the case. And increasingly, we see the conversation that we need to move from the science to the policy. And that's from the natural science to the policy. So there's still a gap there, right? Where we still see a massive gap. And okay, so now we know how many fish we need to allocate for this and that. Now let's go ahead and make the decision. There's still a gap because we don't know the priorities of the people that depend on those fish. We don't know the capacity that exists or doesn't exist within the folks making the decisions, the people that are enforcing the regulations, the people that are competing, right? These are all things that are under the purview of the social sciences, right? So we have politics and governance, as Kate was talking about. And in the applied side of that, we would see sort of bureaucrats, practitioners, right? That kind of, those folks making them, lawyers, managers, And anthropologists, as Yoshi's saying, his background is in anthropology. That's a whole other thing. Like they study culture. So again, like the scope of anthropology is much smaller, right? So it's like, oh, that's just a case study. That's just an anecdote. That's just a small story. And then other ways of knowing that the social science encompass, right? So we can think about history, we think sociology, and all the different fields. But all of these are seen as stories oftentimes, or seen as anecdotes, as opposed to being seen as the world we live in, right? So at what point do we transition from a number, a count, a graph, into actual how people live and how we really need to think about what people care about? And admittedly, there is also a gap between the social science and the policy itself as well. So it's not that the social science is inherently better at creating decision making. I'm just thinking that, you know, if we want to talk about things in silos that need to be meshed, we could think natural science, social science, and governance as well. And I'm sure I'm missing things because I always am, but I'm sure my colleagues here will call me on it if I miss something. And so what I really think that Nexus,
you're doing good.
But I really think that Nexus is great at is changing that story, changing that narrative. It's driven by social science. It's not driven by the natural science perspective, right? We know what we know. We know so much. We can always know more about the science, but we know what we know. So I really think it's time to put the social sciences front and center. And in particular, more of the critical social sciences, because many social sciences, not like economics and sociology, tend to be very numbers based as well, right? And so we're actually telling those deeper stories around the numbers. And
can I ask you, you know, just make you even popular among natural scientists as well. You know, how would you, what, you know, you collaborate in it, you know, what's again, then what's the fun for you to collaborate with natural scientists? I mean, you know, you talked about like a social scientist, and then now you know, you've been collaborating with a lot of natural scientists. What has been the fun for you to collaborate with a natural scientist?
With a natural scientist? What has been fun? That's a hard one.
Right.
That is a tough one. It makes it really difficult because they minimize the stories oftentimes. I mean, I don't want to generalize, right? But I mean, that does happen. There's a lot of tokenism as well, right? We need one monolithic social scientist to communicate what they're saying. And there's a big difference between social science being a communication tool or an education tool, or even a governance tool, right? There's a difference between an applied public policy and a research public policy. And what I really like about Nexus is it's driven by both. It's taking those into account. And the other thing I was going to say that I think is really important is the fact that in a collaboration with 20 institutions, 20 PIs, where we all have our disciplinary backgrounds, but we're able to, so the Nexus strategy, and maybe Yoshi, you can talk about this a little bit later, but centered around, you know, we have 20 projects, but we're sort of in these buckets, right? So for instance, if we're talking about, say, MPAs, we're talking about blue economy, there's a group of us with diverse social science backgrounds working on the same bucket. And that widens our perspectives, right? So it means that, again, to pick on the economist, because I am a former economist, I have a little bit of a background, so I can, it expands the perspective from the economics, right? It'll expand the perspective on the small, narrow case study of an anthropologist by taking into account a broader political economy perspective. So I think another way of collaborating, what I call interdisciplinary social science.
Thank you very much, Anna. I mean, you've been, and then we've all been collaborating with natural scientists, and then as in many conversations, you know, we met a bunch of natural scientists, and then, you know, quite a few of you are in the audience, I believe, and it's actually the Nexus, and you know, from my colleague of the natural scientists, they actually say, hey, that's the capacity we needed to have you guys, you know, come on in. So it's kind of like a really nice to have like a mutual conversation to it, and you know, and as your experience has been making us, you know, quite tremendously valuable. So thanks so much for that. So, I mean, we got Tina, Elaine, we got like 5 more minutes. Am I correct? Right, I suppose so. So I don't really see any questions from the audience, and 7 minutes. Okay, thank you very much. So what I like to do is, if you want to type something right now, we can answer 1 or 2 questions if you type it within about like 3 minutes. And while we're waiting, Kate, are you ready to say the? I'm so sorry to put you on the spot.
Here I was like, he forgot. Yes.
I thought he forgot too.
So spoiler alert to the audience, Yoshi knows I cannot define social equity in a single sentence. He knows this going in. So what I can say is that there is no single answer to what constitutes equity in a situation, because that is always contextual, what constitutes equity. And it's always positional, which means that what I think is equitable may be very different from what you think is equitable, right? So let's start there. Let's say, like, I cannot give you this positive, boom, that's social equity. This is how we'll know it when we see it, because that's not how this topic works. This is a normative topic inherently, right? If any of you have interacted with children at all, you know that this idea of fairness and what is fair is a pretty basic thing to humankind, right? We're really concerned about fairness. And at its core, that is really what equity is about. It's really about fairness. But extending that example, you also know that kids can argue and argue over what is fair in one single situation. That's not fair. Well, it's not fair because of this. Well, it is fair because of this, right? So this is really the issue with social equity. What I can say is in relation to something that Quentin mentioned earlier, this idea that when we have these negotiations, some people end up not getting what they want. It's problematic when those are always the same people. And they're always the people who started out with less, right? That is just inherently problematic. It's problematic morally. As Yoshi started with at the beginning, we are making this moral argument that this is morally problematic. It's also problematic. If you're tuned into this panel, you probably care about ocean governance. So you probably do care about those technically effective solutions, right? One of the things that undermines those technically effective solutions is when we keep on giving the short end of the stick to the same people over and over and over again. And even if we think maybe we can get away with it because they don't have money and they don't have power, over the long run, that undermines everything else that we care about, right? So social equity is a move away from the sort of business as usual approach to just dumping the costs and the harms and so on and so forth on the same group of people, the people who are already struggling maybe with poverty or struggling maybe with, subsistence lifestyles that are no longer as possible as they once were, or struggling with lack of access to express their voice in political fora or what have you. I think that's probably as short as I can do, Yash. I'm happy to elaborate as time allows if you like.
Thank you very much, Kate. And thanks very much to all the colleagues. I wanted to say we are a very inclusive group, and we like to be a platform to facilitate this conversation and push towards a societal good. So Nexus, for me, our client is researchers who is thinking the same and really pushing this boundary about environment, ocean, and equity. It's a very difficult conversation, but really I would like to work with people who want to push this boundary, and please feel free to contact us. And through that, I'm hoping university, okay, that's my kids. The university will function again, is a platform to enhance this conversation. I'm taking Andres' words, is we don't have to defend ourselves, to talk about social equity in the context of the ocean, in the context of environment anymore. We don't have to defend ourselves to talk about justice. We don't have to defend ourselves to talk about people when we talk about the ocean, and this is really the new era. So I welcome if anybody wants to talk with us from our colleagues in the Pacific Rim. This is not an easy time, so I wanted to thank all the participants and all the attendants, all the listeners to be in this conversation. And Anna, Andreas, Kate, Quentin, thank you very much for being in this conversation. And Quentin's father, thank you very much driving him safely. And thanks a lot for everyone. At least I really wanted to thank Christina, Tina, Elaine, and if I forgot anyone, and Hilary also put a comment. Thank you very much, Hilary, for being in this conversation. And so thank you very much for everyone. And we hope that we're going to have, again, conversation with APRU colleagues and people in the Pacific Rim. Thank you so much. Take care and take it easy. Be safe. And thanks a lot. Okay.
Thanks,
Bye, everyone.
Have a good night, morning, evening. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.